My 12-year-old daughter was loving the series Heartstopper, which focuses on male same-sex relationships. When I said that books didn't exist like this when I was a kid, her brother asked what I meant, and she chimed in and said how they didn't have illustrated graphic novels when I was a teenager. And it made me realize how her age group normalizes same-sex relationships. But to have meaningful conversations, it's actually me who needs to widen my understanding of the spectrum of relationships.
Just a Sec Education acknowledges the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians and the original educators of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We recognise that this land was never ceded. A few disclaimers before we jump in. This is a sexuality education podcast. For this series, our content will be aimed at parents of 8 to 12-year-olds. Naturally, we'll be talking about bodies, puberty, sex, porn, and other related topics, so please use your judgment when playing it aloud. Hello and welcome to Let's Talk, a podcast by Just a Sec. I'm your host, Fran Folks Taylor, and I'm a sexologist, I'm a dietitian, and I'm the founder of Frank Sexology, where I provide sexuality education in Geraldton, Western Australia. Relationships are a part of life. Our communication, behaviours, and emotional regulation all contribute to the strength or breakdown of our connections with other people. And the research is clear. The strength of our relationships is the biggest predictor of lifelong health and happiness. So I'd say they're probably worth putting some time and energy into. How then do you get good at doing relationships? Surely there's a manual out there. Well, we're not going to give you a manual, but in today's episode, we are going to be talking about relationships, respect, and consent. And to help us navigate relationships, respect, and consent, today in the studio, we have with us Imogen Senior. And joining us online, we have Giselle Woodley. Imogen is currently a relationships and sexuality educator with Body Safety Australia, working with students, parents and educators. She completed her honours research last year, exploring ideas of consent and want in Victorian teaching resources. Giselle Woodley is a sexologist. She is also a researcher and PhD candidate at Edith Cowan University and researches with young people and parents exploring their perspectives of their relationships and sexuality education and of online sexual content. Welcome, Imogen and Giselle.
So happy to be here. Thank you.
Now, before we get into the episode, I want to put to you both a question that we ask all of our guests on this podcast, which is, who is your sex ed hero? I'll start with you, Imogen. Who's your sex ed hero?
I think I'm probably going to have to say my mum. When I was, I think in year 4 or 5, she bought me the book Puberty Girl.
Great.
And I was so excited to finally be learning about growing up. And I remember carrying this book around in public and showing everyone that I was finally learning about growing up. And I think that kind of enthusiasm that my mum cultivated in me as a young child to get ready to grow up and to figure out all this tricky stuff about relationships and also instill in me a bit of a fiery spirit has done me quite well so far.
Oh, that's amazing. How did your friends feel about you showing them the book?
I was surprised that not everyone was as excited to get the first period.
No?
I was like, what are you guys talking about?
Yes.
This should be so much fun. The best time was when I was walking around the airport at one point and it was underneath my arm because I was going to read it the whole flight. But yeah, not all my friends shared my enthusiasm, got to say.
No, that's great. Thank you. And Giselle, who's your sex ed hero?
Well, mine actually has to be a joint second, I'm afraid, if that's okay. Mine would be
Cool.
Dr. Laurel Mayberry and Dr. Jacqueline Hendricks, mostly because they co-taught a unit that I studied in sexology, which was sexological education, and that completely transformed my path. And I realized the power of sexuality education in terms of reducing sexual violence and increasing individual well-being. So I think that really transformed and was really inspiring for me. So yeah, a close second for me, a close joint first for me.
Agree. I think I also know Jackie and Laurel, and they're very inspiring.
Fabulous.
Great. So we're going to kick it off with our first question. So I'm going to ask you, Imogen, what is consent?
Yeah, so we can define consent as free agreement to an activity, sexual or otherwise, without the presence of pressure, coercion or force. And we often kind of think about it in a sexual capacity, but it's something we're practicing all the time in the way we're interacting with people around us.
Can we talk a little bit about how consent differs from permission?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I think permission, we can think about it as a bit of begrudging sometimes, kind of give permission for a company to collect our data or things that maybe we're not actually that keen for. It can be quite passive and also can be quite black and white. And so when we're talking about consent, we want to be pushing past that incredibly black and white boundary and talking about power and how that influences the type of decisions we're making and the way that ideally consent is something that is enthusiastic. It's not a passive or begrudging yes, but something that we are wanting to give to the people around us.
I really like, Imogen, that you said ideally enthusiastic, because I think although it's purported that consent should be enthusiastic, I think it's important to recognize that it isn't necessarily always a full-on enthusiastic response to do something. I think it's important to acknowledge that there sometimes is trepidation and nervousness around new experiences as well, and that's okay. So I suppose really teaching as well, and I suppose we'll go on to talk about this, is really leaning into feeling whether you actually want to consent to something, and acknowledging that it may not always be completely enthusiastic, but as long as willing and open is important.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that it wasn't just in sexual context. What are some of those everyday situations where we use consent?
Yeah, so anytime we're talking about like doing things with our bodies, like hugging people or even borrowing objects from the people around us, we're normally asking for people's consent to be doing those things. And when we're talking with young children, often it is those things about holding hands and hugging and how we share ourselves and our bodies and the things that we own with those people around us.
So it could be something as small as, can I please hold your hand?
Absolutely.
Or borrow your bag or... And Giselle, did you have anything?
Yeah, maybe any medical procedures as well, like a visit to the GP or any sort of procedure as well is a form of consent. And that's why consent really has to be informed as well, which is an important component, really knowing what you're consenting to. In the giving and receiving of consent, offering that information as well is so imperative.
And when should we start talking about romantic or sexual consent with our children? And I guess, how do we do this?
Absolutely. So we go in to early learning centres with 3, 4, 5-year-olds and are teaching the basic ideas of consent. When we're doing it there, we're not talking about sexual or even romantic consent. We're talking about, again, the hugs. Talking about holding hands, all of those type of things. And slowly as we get older and people have more awareness of their bodies, we can start talking about relationships and romantic relationships and bringing in sexuality to that and the nuances that each of those add to the conversation around consent. But it really is quite simple in the younger years, even just explaining before children even have an understanding of the world around them, what you're doing to them. So as infants talking about, and now we're going to do this. And sometimes when consent with very young children does have to be negotiated, things like health, hygiene and safety, when we have to hold our hand across the road or we do have to brush our teeth, being able to have conversations where we're informing why these things have to happen so that there is still a degree of understanding and autonomy about what's happening to people's bodies, even at a very young age.
And in terms of like romantic relationships or in a sexual context, when do we kind of broach those subjects? Like is 8 to 12 the right age or?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do start talking about crushes and how we tell people we like them or whether we do or don't in years 3 to 4. And in 5 to 6, we start talking about consent in the context of relationships and the older years, sexual consent as well, so that we're really getting in there early so that people are prepared once they do start to think and enter the world full of romantic relationships.
Yeah, I would say that with our research, so we conduct research with young people aged 11 to 17, as well as their parents. And something that I think came across in the research is that young people felt conversations about relationships and sex, including consent, were occurring too late in their households. So young people themselves felt like around 10 was a really good age to start talking about sex specifically and more explicitly in more detail, so that they were thus prepared in their teenage years, particularly for online contexts as well. And of course, the data suggests that young people are accessing far younger than this, but really recognizing consent in online spaces as well was something that was missing from the conversation, and they really felt that the conversations needed to happen earlier so that they were prepared for such content.
And how would you recommend sort of broaching that subject for parents and carers?
I think being really open and curious is super important.
Mm.
Maintaining a judgment-free stance where possible, and really maintaining a sense of curiosity. So, in terms of words, asking questions, I think is really important, and maintaining that open dialogue. Film, TV, books can be amazing, or poor representations of relationships and scenarios of where consent has been enacted. And they can be great moments to discuss and open the discussion and keep the discussion open, and also acknowledging, of course, that it's an ongoing conversation. It isn't just a one
Yeah.
conversation. And I think for a lot of us as parents, we didn't have discussions about consent. There was very little regard for boundaries sometimes, especially depending on what cultural background you're from. And so this is new for a lot of us, and it's new territory. And although there's much more support than there was, we have to be, gentle with ourselves as well, recognizing that we don't always have the answers as well, and that's okay. And it's okay to respond with, "Hey, we can figure out this out together." And it's a great moment to learn as a parent as well, and with your child. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Mm.
Vanessa Hamilton has an amazing book called, I think it's called Talking.
Talking the talk.
Yeah, and she has a great book that gives conversation starter tips for those teachable moments. And I think that's a great
Yeah.
resource as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vanessa is one of our guests for this series as well. So there you go. So we'll definitely have that resource linked. And how can we help our kids to, I guess, feel empowered when it comes to consent or not consenting to an activity?
Empowerment is tricky because we can't just tell our kids, you have the right to say yes and no, when a lot of the time those yeses and those nos aren't actually respected. So creating the conditions where kids feel like they can not consent to things, and that being respected at home and at school. And it's as simple as like talking about their boundaries, and figuring out how as a family you navigate those.
Yeah.
So it's all well and good to be going into schools and saying, your body is your own, you can do what you like with it. But that's really tricky if that message is then diluted by the kids, having to be picked up and moved by adults without having that explained. Or, at home, if there's lots of images being taken of them without their consent, it's then put online. The idea that their body is their own and their image is their own online is much harder to get across. So it's a two-way street where we're empowering the child to be able to say no in assertive ways and to be in touch with their feelings and understand what their body is telling them about what they want, but also creating the conditions where when that happens, that's respected. And when they want to do something or don't want to do something, you can have that conversation with them where they feel empowered, not just are told that they are empowered.
I think that's a great question and great answer, Imogen, as well. And just, I suppose, to build on what Imogen has said, I think as a baby or a toddler, you don't necessarily get to consent to whatever's happening to you, because you as a parent have to make, I need to put you to sleep now, and now it's time for a bath. And they may not necessarily want to do that at that time.
No.
So I suppose there's a little bit of an unlearning that has to happen as well, in terms of, I actually do have bodily autonomy, and I do have rights, and recognizing that and encouraging that as well. So I think it's a really interesting question, because I really see consent as sort of a baseline foundation for the rest of essential relationships and sexuality education necessary skills. And so I think in terms of feeling empowered, it's really about building other skills and qualities within young people. So self-love, confidence, really being able to listen to themselves and prioritize their own needs in accordance with recognizing their own limits and boundaries.
And every time we're talking to children about their bodies belonging to them and how to navigate what they're feeling in their body so that they know what they want, that's also a conversation about everyone else around them and the fact that their bodies belong to them. And that person is going to be having feelings and different wants about what they want to be doing. And so building not just empowerment of that child, but a kind of relational community aspect where we're talking about how we think about other people's bodies in space. And the same rights that we're teaching you, everyone else also has.
Yeah. And in the context of consent and pleasure, like should we be teaching pleasure in this context of consent to our children?
Absolutely. So lots of forms of pleasure exist. We're not just talking about sexual pleasure. And key to particularly body safety education is building an awareness of what feelings feel like in our bodies.
Yeah.
So at a really young age, we can be talking about, what does happy feel like? Where do you feel happy in your body? Is it, jiggly fingers? Is it kind of tappy toes and a heartbeat?
Yeah.
And, pleasure in the same way. And that can build a capacity for people to understand in the present and also much later on when it comes to sexual pleasure, what they want in order to be able to then figure out how that transforms into consent. In the same time, we're teaching what sadness feels like in our bodies, where we feel anger in our bodies and where we feel scared. And by tapping into those feelings, we're able to the child can connect with themselves, their feelings, instead of just feeling kind of external things. This is a happy thing. This is a scared thing. We can actually figure out what we want and what our boundaries are. Exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to add a research lens to this, I think, for this question, because I think what Imogen said is so great and is particularly pertinent in a non-sexual context. If it's okay to speak about, I suppose, more in a sexual context, I think what we found in our research speaking to young people is that in their relationships and sexuality education, it's very much from a risk-aware, fear-based lens. So, STIs, how not to get pregnant, online safety, and growingly consent. And, the focus on consent in schools, as schools scramble to keep up with the updated discourse, I think is very much from the lens of giving and receiving permission and discussing sex only within really the context of unwanted sexual experiences and sexual assault. And I think what we found is with young people, that's creating fears around sex. And for other young people, we're having phenomenon such as young people are wanting to write contracts for sex to make sure that it's all above board, or they maintain certain boundaries, which would normally seem healthy, but they're basically boundaries to make sure that they're not in trouble. So I think that duty of care and that balance about, the joys of sex is missing because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing fears around sex. We're seeing sex only discussed in a risk-aware, fear-based narrative. And I think it's really, really important to balance that with the joys of sexual interactions. And like Imogen said, that starts in a non-sexual way and acknowledging pleasurable experiences in a non-sexual context. But I think it's really important to start talking about sex and consent in the context of pleasurable experiences. And something that we did ask young people as well in our research is that, a lot of adults fear that talking about sex is basically going to make young people go out and have sex, or it's going to sexualize them. And the response by young people was, that's absolutely not true. We would far prefer to be equipped and know what's out there. A lot of young people say that's so dumb to use the child-centric language. That's absolutely not the case. They really wanted to be prepared and engaged beforehand. So I think that's important to recognize.
I think it's absolutely true as well, specifically for young girls and gender marginalised people and queer people, the idea of talking about pleasurable and good aspects of sex, because if sex is only something that's spoken about in that risk lens, then it's hard to know what you want and to say yes if we've only been offered that negative view. So in that way, pleasure is protective because by actually empowering the kind of good aspects, we actually set the bar much higher.
So we're going to move on to relationships sort of more broadly. What are healthy and unhealthy relationships, and are you able to describe maybe how that exists on a spectrum?
relationships obviously exist on a spectrum, because we can never understand anything in a complete binary of what healthy and unhealthy is in a relationship, and people are different, and the relationships that we're going to have with different people are different. There are basic tenets of healthy relationships. Too many to list here, but good communication and kind of trust and honesty and mutual respect between different people, and in older years for some people involves a healthy sexual relationship. And a lot of those inverse form unhealthy relationships, where there's the breakdown of communication, or there's distrust, dishonesty, and a lack of equality between the power that each person holds in that relationship. But we can understand, obviously, that we might have some of these things in different relationships, and being able to figure out can be quite tricky. Where a relationship is currently sitting. And I do think it's useful to go back to what we teach very young kids about feelings, and what does it feel like when you're with this person, and where do you feel it in your body? Do you feel calm? Do you feel anxious? And those type of feelings is a good way to ground us in where are we currently sitting in the health of this relationship. But I'd love to hear from Giselle.
I think that was a great response, but I think maybe I would just add is that in terms of a spectrum, you've got sort of healthy relationships, which are the skills that Imogen talked about: great communication, honesty, trust, and mutual respect. And then I suppose the lines become a little bit blurred for some people, I think, when it comes to toxic or unhealthy relationships. And then you've got abuse. So I suppose, to come from personal experience, I'm on a lot of mothers groups as a parent. And, that's where parents go to for a lot of advice on parenting. But I also see so many other mothers heartbreakingly share incidences of their relationships and not being able to differentiate what's unhealthy and what's abuse. And I think that's so heartbreaking. So really speaking, I suppose, about healthy relationships on a spectrum in terms of healthy and unhealthy behaviors, and being able to recognize what constitutes abuse, so that people can get out as well and recognize those behaviors.
And so in terms, I guess, of one end of that spectrum being abuse, verbal, physical, financial, and all those forms of abuse, there is that sort of not grey area, but aspects of unhealthy relationships which, may crop up in some healthy relationships, but then if they go sort of the other way, can, turn into abuse. What are some of those amber flags, I suppose, that some people might describe?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very different for different people. And a lot of it is kind of just the trickiness between those two binaries of trust and a lack of trust. So often we see jealousy as obviously can form a part of an abusive relationship, where there's a kind of toxic level of control that's exerted over a person. But it can be quite tricky sometimes to ascertain what level of jealousy in a relationship is appropriate, and the kind of how we're able to restrict who partners are hanging out with, or how we're existing with other people. And so some of those people can really struggle with trust, and what trust looks like in different relationships can form amber flags, and can also be a part of quite abusive relationships depending on how it manifests.
Yeah.
When we talk about those yellow flags, it's really about repeat offending, I think, and teaching young people that if you repetitively, your boundaries aren't being met, like obviously, I suppose with boundaries, for a lot of limits, sometimes you won't know yourself where your limit is until it's reached. And sometimes that's not necessarily communicated to a partner. So how can they know that limit if it wasn't previously communicated? So I think it's more about the repeat offending. If something has been explicitly stated, hey, I don't like this, and it's repeatedly ignored, or there's an inequality in the relationship, and there's evidence of power dynamics or continuous disrespect, I think that's where that grey area is good to teach in terms of recognizing that and differentiating from abuse, or whether it's just a one-off mistake that can be rectified. Because you're right, these behaviors do happen in healthy relationships as well, and it's about that sort of repairing afterwards, and whether that's happening and being respected.
And how do we teach our kids, I suppose, the difference between those red, amber, green flags, not to sort of pigeonhole those behaviours into the flags, but, how do we show them that certain behaviours are not okay? And I guess on the other side that, yes, certain behaviours are part of a really healthy relationship.
I think it's really useful to, I keep saying this, but bring kids back to their feelings about how different interactions feel with them, and create a space in whatever communication style works for your particular family, where they can kind of come to you and express how different things are feeling. So whether that's in the car drive home, how's your friendship with Sam? And being able to just ask curious questions about how they feel with different people, how those relationships kind of sit inside their body, and obviously setting rules about what is red flag behavior, but having a kind of open dialogue about how the relationships sit for them. We can obviously use teachable moments as well, where we're using kind of media and talking to them about do we think that this person's feeling good or happy in this relationship right now, or do they not feel that way? And finding that kind of curiosity to be able to ask without, I guess, punishing or shutting down those conversations when they do come up.
Yeah, I suppose information is so important. So offering information where possible on healthy relationship dynamics and that spectrum, as well as, like Imogen said, being able to respond to questions and queries, whether is this okay, and having that open dialogue to be able to respond. And I'm not sure if this is a good space to say this, but I think also modeling is so, so important when it comes to healthy relationships. And those lines can become really blurred if a household isn't safe. And, we learn from what we see, and that can sometimes be replicated in our own relationships and whether we recognize them as healthy or unhealthy. So I think coming at it from how can we better teach is really modeling healthy relationships. And that doesn't necessarily mean never have an argument. It's okay to show, hey, we can have an argument and we can repair and come together and resolve after a conflict and come together safely. It's safe to have a conflict. In fact, probably a bit unhealthy to never have a conflict. So recognizing that conflicts can and do happen, but you can come back together and you can grow and you can learn, and it's safe to have that, I think, is really important.
I guess talking about boundaries with kids and how we do that, like how should we react if someone doesn't respect our boundaries?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk a lot about assertive communication and how kind of equip kids to have the language to be able to say, no, that doesn't sit, I don't like it, that doesn't work, or please don't do that. Obviously, again, it is about creating the conditions as well where kids are used to that being respected when they say it.
Yeah.
We might see, some kind of more compliant kids who aren't as used to that assertive communication, but creating kind of almost practices of where that happens. In young kids, we do it with kind of, tickling and then say stop when you want that to not happen anymore, and then they can set that boundary and actually practice feeling what it feels like when a boundary is respected and making that a really healthy, safe time. And I think getting used to the feeling of saying no, that being fine, that not altering a relationship in any way. And then when there are tricky things that happen where we don't feel respected, having people to go to be able to talk about it in a way that has space for discussion and unpacking, and also without punishment. So making sure that we're not then kind of withdrawing that person from social interaction, or if a boundary's been broken online, sometimes see kind of a freak out, oh my goodness, and then removing the device from the child, and it can often feel punitive even if that's not our intention. And so again, comes back to curiosity. How did that feel when that boundary was broken? How do we make sure that doesn't happen again in a way that doesn't feel like I'm punishing you for asserting a boundary in the first place?
I think just to add to that, I would say is that saying a no is really easy for kids when they're young. No becomes a favorite word for a toddler. And then as we progressively become older, no becomes actually harder to say. And we tend towards people-pleasing tendencies, and it's a scary thing to say. And the research shows that teens in particular, including preteens, when they don't want something, they don't tend to use the word no. They use other sentences as well. So I think recognizing that a no is difficult to communicate, and so giving young people tools to communicate that in other ways as well. And then from the other side of things is recognizing that maintaining and managing rejection as well, which is part of boundaries, I suppose, and teaching young people not to take it personally, that it's okay to say no, that you don't have, and it's okay to receive a no. You don't have to take that as a personal reflection on yourself, that someone just doesn't want to do this activity. It's in no means a reflection on you, and likewise feeling safe to navigate that in healthy ways.
And in terms of communication, how do we, I guess, teach our kids that communication is so important? Like, is it just modelled, or do we have those specific conversations about how to communicate or what good communication looks like?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is modelled, both in kind of other relationships that you have with people around the kids and also the child, and talking about just communicating what your style of communication is with the child, and recognizing that there are different communication styles. Again, the kind of sometimes kids like to text, and that's another style of communication that does obviously bring with it a whole heap of other technological challenges,
which we'll get into in a moment.
I think a lot of it comes from kind of just repeated, modelled behaviour, teachable moments when it arises, if there has been a breakdown in communication between siblings, or between, they've witnessed it happening, and then kind of going, oh, that was, we found it difficult to talk to each other in that moment. Why did that happen? What happened? And what did you actually want to say? And how did you feel with what you wanted to tell me then? And I think a lot of it can be embedded in the way we're already communicating every day, so we may as well talk about it.
Unpacking those breakdowns
I think also, we've talked about what it looks like in an unhealthy sense, but talking about what are we specifically modeling as well, in terms of showing support for one another as well, showing support and building trust and growing together. That can be displayed to young people as well. And I think as well, pointing out or recognizing when we don't communicate well and using that as a teachable moment. So, often you have the response of the silent treatment because you don't know how to deal with the situation. And we can now sort of recognize that that's not actually a healthy way to respond. But maybe perhaps recognizing later, I responded by storming off, or I responded by, I didn't respond, or I blanked. And I recognize that that's not actually the best way to respond. And, maybe that might be a situation where I actually needed space, but that could have been communicated better. So I think recognizing and owning our mistakes when we don't communicate well, I think is a teachable moment both for ourselves and young people and our children, is sort of saying, hey, I didn't navigate that really very well. I could have done this better. And I think that's a great way to model behaviors and a teachable moment for everyone.
And do you think, Giselle, that with, I guess, phones and social media now, that does add that more complex element to communication?
That's a great question. I think we need to start having conversations about how we navigate communicating well online as well as in real life. And although it's a different communication style or communication, I suppose, platform, it's technically still the same principles really do apply. So in terms of respect for one another, in terms of empathy, in terms of navigating online spheres where people communicate in online chats or online forums, and making sure that those basic principles of empathy and respect still relay. And I think having conversations around how it's easier, I suppose, to have so you can talk about keyboard worrying and trolling and things like that, and sort of talk about how sometimes online spheres, some people can be not as nice, or they can be mean, or bullying can be a little
Very
bit
diplomatic.
can be a little bit more prevalent because people do feel as if there's a wall up, or there's a level of protection. And so I think navigating that both from a stance of you may encounter this, but also from the point of view of how are you going to navigate your conversations, because anything you say online, you should be able to say to someone's face. I think that's a really important thing to teach to young people as well, in terms of having respectful communications in online spheres as well.
I think a lot of stuff around online and kids being online is the importance of, again, that curiosity about what your kid is doing online, how they're communicating online, who they're speaking to, we know that there are scary things that happen online, and how we protect kids from that without becoming paranoid and reactive. And a lot of it comes back to being curious about how they're communicating, who they're talking to, what are they playing, who can they talk to when they're online, to make sure that we're protecting them in a way that is empowering.
And what about specifically in relationships? So say a parent's 12-year-old is in a relationship, or maybe they are being contacted by someone that they don't want to talk to and they have to communicate that, say it's via text. Like, would you help them navigate that, like ghosting and stuff like that? Would those be topics that you cover or you talk about?
Tone, as you said, tone isn't necessarily communicated in online communications and in relationships online. And that's such an important factor where information or communication can be misconstrued or misunderstood. So having conversations around that to be really clear with your communications. And again, those principles coming across are really holding someone else in your communication. And also, I suppose when the non-verbal elements are missing, the power of emojis, I suppose, as well. And because really that's your way to non-verbally
Kids use
communicate.
emojis anymore.
I still use
absolutely.
emojis, but I have to say I'm ironic when I'm using them. Like, I promise it's not cringe.
And then, I suppose young people then start deliberating about, what does this emoji mean? Does it mean this or this? So there's this whole new online world there in terms of communicating online. And, young people are going to understand this far better than ourselves. But just really, I think, teaching those same principles. And I suppose we've been talking about consent. I think really making sure those same principles of consent apply to online context. So really making sure that in online spheres, in online forums, that the giving and receiving or agreement to a situation is voluntarily given and agreed upon by both parties or all parties, which I think can be really misconstrued and easily overlooked in online interactions. It gets a little bit messier.
Yeah, which is something, again, that we can be building from a very young age. It's pretty talked about now that we talk about how our bodies are our own. But as I mentioned earlier, our images are our own too, and images of, that we take of kids and post online, and how we kind of post those pictures and ask their consent if we're putting an image of them online, can be really good empowerment building tools that can be protective of abuse, but also can help facilitate the idea that bodies and consent and ownership of bodies and the ability to consent to what happens to your body is something that transcends, physicalness and can go into online spaces as well. And so using that as a kind of teachable moment where we ask, are you okay if I post this? Can help show that the same principles of communication and consent that we teach in real life translates into the online world as well.
Yeah.
And I suppose to add a research lens to that, if that's okay, with our research with teens, we found that in the age group, even between 8 and 12, that, well, I suppose we refer to it as sexting, but young people refer to it as sending nudes, is quite prevalent within that age, starting to be quite prevalent within that age group. And for a lot of young people, is their first engagement with sexual content is an image without their consent landing in their phones. And for a lot of young people, they would say, I actually didn't even know what I was looking at, or this is not what I asked for. And it rendered the experience a lot more harmful and traumatizing when they weren't prepared and they weren't consenting to such an experience. So I think having those conversations about this is what you might encounter, consent is absolutely paramount, and navigating that response back to parties that engage in those communications are important skills to navigate as well.
And we touched on it earlier, but in terms of conflict and conflict resolution, are there any sort of basic principles that we should be teaching our kids when it comes to, resolving conflicts, or how to have a good fight, not a good fight?
No, absolutely. I think recognizing conflict is okay, and it can be different for different genders, where different emotions like anger are accessible to girls, boys, different people in very different ways. And so an important lesson for girls, gender marginalized people in some cases might be, anger is fine. It's one of the emotions that we experience. It can be hiding something else that we're feeling, whether we're feeling hurt or betrayed. And it's okay to bring that up. And it's okay to have anger and conflict and disagreement in a relationship, but we still should be feeling safe, and we still should be feeling respected and cared for while we kind of work through that conflict. And sometimes it's useful to think about in a relationship being a team, kind of you and the person you're disagreeing with against the problem, and how you figure out and navigate your way through that issue as a team. But obviously that kind of perspective does need that underlying respect and care and safety ultimately.
Yep.
So normalizing anger and conflict and disagreement as something that can happen, but something that shouldn't make us feel
Unsafe.
unsafe or scared for our well-being.
Yeah.
That's such an important point, Imogen, about recognizing that in a healthy relationship, it's a team, not you against each other, because it can often turn into that in fights and ongoing arguments as well. And really recognizing that you're a team together. I think also, and to add to that would be acknowledging your own contribution, or acknowledging where you've gone wrong as well, or apologizing. I think that's important too. It takes two to tango. And in a fight or a conflict, it can be really easy to butt heads and blame and nasty words, etc. And I think there's a term in psychology called rupture and repair. So it's about after ruptures, repairing, turning inwards, not facing away from each other, not literally, but figuratively, turning inwards into the relationship. Working towards that repair and coming back together. And I think part of that is encouraging the acknowledgement of, hey, I've done this wrong, or I could have done this better, and I'm sorry. And I think that's really important in the resolution of conflict, is making it a safe space to apologize, and making it a safe space for you both to recognize your mistakes and what you could have done better and what you intend to do better in the future. So also, I suppose part of conflict resolution is also working towards solutions that are achievable as well. So what have we learned from this? What can we do better? What can we implement to make sure this doesn't happen again, or that we can progress and grow together?
And what about in terms of those elements of conflict resolution, like active listening and asking open questions? Like, how do they fit in, or how could we teach those?
I think when we're in conflict, we have this instinct to want to win. And so we might be listening to the other person's sentences or qualms or worries about the relationship, just in the context of how we're going to respond.
Yep.
So it's kind of like, oh, yeah, I know I can say this in response to that. This is what I'm going to say back. And these kind of like gotcha moments that come quite naturally to us sometimes.
Yeah.
And so it can be really tricky, but trying to do active listening where we're actually just trying to listen to what the person is telling us.
Yeah.
And rather than seeing the conflict as a debate that we have to try and win or get our argument across, it's more of a kind of presentation where we're laying stuff on the table to each other about how we're feeling, and then we're looking at that together and thinking about, okay, how do we address this now?
Understanding.
Exactly. And actually hearing what they're saying instead of just kind of like listening. And taking a moment to go, yes, okay, I understand where this is coming from, for you, before we dive in with our response.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd agree with that, Imogen. I think it's so easy to think to, instead of actually listening to what someone's trying to communicate to you, is already thinking, oh, how am I going to respond to this? I know I'm guilty of that myself as well. And I think
Lord knows.
really teaching active listening, so really, really listening to what the other person says. And sometimes that can be helpful to repeat back what they've said in the form of a question, as well as saying, so as I'm to understand it, you would like this from me, or you're saying this. And that can also give them the opportunity to correct that information as well, and say, or reiterate, or add more understanding to it. No, that's not necessarily what I'm saying. I'm actually saying you're not listening to me here, for instance, if that was the complaint. So I think, asking sort of, I guess, those open-ended questions as well, and making sure that giving the other person the opportunity to express their desires or express their concerns in a healthy and mutually respectable way. And then hopefully through that open communication and navigating that conflict, you can then reach a consensus and make sure that you can agree to be on the same page, or agree to what you're going to do better from here, whether that means enacting some sort of change, or someone's going to try and do something better. Hopefully it's, a healthy component of relationships is compromise and negotiation. And I think that's all part of the conflict resolution skills, is being able to come at it from different places, or hopefully from as a team. But being able to recognize and share your standpoint, but working together cohesively, and whether that means a negotiation or a compromise to reach that consensus, navigating that in a healthy and consensual and respectful way.
In terms of relationships generally, obviously we live in quite a heteronormative society. How do we make sure our children feel supported to explore non-heterosexual relationships or, queer relationships? How do we make sure that they know that their parents are supportive?
Absolutely. I think a lot of it can come back to small teachable moments again, when we're watching media, when we're talking about potential future partners. It can be easy to slip back into kind of heteronormative frames when we're talking about kids' future lives, but finding little moments to just affirm support that it's there, and just be like, oh, this couple on the TV is a gay couple, and just normalizing it as part of general life.
I think also recognizing that we're moving into a more inclusive, diverse world, but not necessarily every parent is feeling safe or encouraging of that. And recognizing that in yourself, if you're feeling that way, is to also recognize that healthy relationships take all forms, and that love is love. And that despite how anyone decides to identify or who they choose to love, that bringing it back to basics about what is important, and the same relationship principles apply, and really like working through your own views if that is the case for you, and attitudes and beliefs and values. And I think that happens with anything with having a child, and particularly with sexuality education, because it is so value laden. You're constantly going to be challenged as a parent. And as generations update and new knowledge and new practices take place, there's going to be new challenges. And so it is a constant challenge within yourself. So I think really looking within, and when you're seeing bias or struggle coming up as a parent, I think recognizing that and being okay with it. You grew up in a, recognizing, and I think also being, I suppose, gentle with yourself and say, look, I know I grew up in a different context. This is different. This is new for me, and being open and asking questions, but still making sure that you're offering support and love, and maintaining that those same principles apply.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Compassion and effort is always more important and more felt by a child than getting it completely right first go. So showing support and care for their decisions or identities is the most important thing. And obviously effort towards getting it right is vital, but it's that effort and that compassion, the feeling that someone gets with you as a person, that will always be more important than teaching it exactly right or knowing the correct kind of way to talk to your kids about it.
Absolutely. And I think that applies, in all contexts and for all people, it's about the intention and the care. And look, there are a lot of changes and people are adapting. And so I think, at the end of the day, it's just, showing respect, care.
Absolutely.
So we're now going to move on to Sex Ed Spotlight. So this is where we have a question that's sent in by a parent or carer from the community, and our guests help us answer it. Remember that these responses can be tailored to suit listeners' personal situations, of course. So our question today is from the mum of an 11-year-old child. She says, my 11-year-old spoke to me the other day asking how to tell someone you like them without getting rejected or feeling awkward. I spoke about respect and the possibility of the other person not feeling the same way, but I don't think I nailed it. Do you have some hints, please?
Sounds like done a fabulous job. I think it's really tricky. Rejection can really suck, and making space for feeling hurt and feeling sad when that happens in kind of within the home, so that hurt isn't always projected just onto the person who's done the rejection. Feeling awkward is an inevitability. Rejection is entirely possible. And so I think sounds like this parent's done a great job of actually creating that possibility for the child. Instead of, in the past, we've seen those narratives of just keep trying, this persistence is key, in a way that completely goes against any notion of consent.
Yeah.
But acknowledging awkwardness, acknowledging that rejection might happen, totally fine, doesn't say anything about you as a person, but remembering the rights that the other person has and the obligation to care for how we're impacting other people, but also going, really well done, like you did a great job telling someone you like them. That's scary. And that is capacity building as well for just a great communication that will get easier over time as well.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful response, Imogen. I don't know how much more I can add to that, to be honest, but I would say that just also recognizing that I don't think there is a non-awkward way to do that. It's a terrifying thing to do.
Absolutely.
It's a terrifying thing to do, to approach someone and say you like them. But I think also recognizing that, rejection is a part of life. And I think building that resilience is really important as well, being able to pick yourself up again and say, hey, I think a lot of us have that fear of rejection, or we have fear of failure, and it impacts not just our relationships, but, our everyday lives, our careers, how we engage at school. And so I think it's a moment to teach about, resilience and picking yourself up again and, hey, maybe not this time, but maybe next time. And being okay with that and not taking that personally or on as a reflection of yourself or your self-esteem or your self-worth, I think is really important. But I also think they did a fab job.
Yeah. And when they say they didn't nail it, you don't have to nail it, I think just talking at all is really important. Like that's the most important thing.
Absolutely. Sex ed isn't like a perfect manual
No,
where you say the right script to your
awkward
kid. It's a relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Now, just for our listeners, where can they find you or your work? Imogen?
Probably LinkedIn's best place for me.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And that's just Imogen Senior?
Imogen Senior.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yep, wonderful. Giselle?
For me, it would be, my name's Giselle Woodley, and then I have a few articles on The Conversation, and I suppose on LinkedIn and other various media. Come and say hello if you want to.
Brilliant. Always open to chat.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And for any resources we mentioned today, our listeners, please go to our show notes. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow and share with your community. And you can find us on Instagram at its_justasec or online at itsjustasec.com. I'm Fran. Thank you for listening, and remember, it only takes just a sec to start these conversations.